Our first speaker of the afternoon session is Mara Zimmerman, who's the Executive Director of the Coast Salmon Partnership in Washington State. Mara holds a PhD in biology from the University of Michigan, and her career has been dedicated to the study and conservation of fish and their habitats. As Executive Director of Coast Salmon Partnership, Mara works with tribes, local governments, and nonprofit organizations to protect and restore salmon habitat in the watersheds along Washington's Pacific coast. Mara, it's great to have you join us. The floor is yours, so take it away.
Well, thank you. This afternoon, I am going to talk about our work to incorporate climate resilience into habitat protection and restoration on Washington coast. I think providing a nice segue from some of the morning presentations. I wanted to acknowledge my co-author, Grace Adams at the Coast Salmon Partnership, as well as a very large group of people who have served on the core team and work groups to help us to develop this project. My presentation is divided into 5 sections. I'll start with an introduction of the Coast Salmon Partnership for those of you who may not be aware, and also the need for a climate adaptation framework for salmon recovery in our region. I'll spend the majority of the presentation focused on the Climate Resilience Index and its application, and finally describe some next steps with our work. The geographical focus for this presentation is Washington's Pacific coast, which encompasses 3.75 million acres of landscape. This is a sparsely populated area. It includes 6 federally recognized tribes, all of which have deep cultural roots to fishing, hunting, and gathering in the region. The region is known for its abundant resources, which include 133 populations of salmon, steelhead, trout, and char. The Coast Salmon Partnership is a regional salmon recovery organization. We are one of 7 organizations in the state, organized under state statute, with a place-based focus on salmon and steelhead recovery. The partnership was formed by interlocal agreement among tribes, counties, cities, and port districts of the region. Oversight is provided by our board of directors that represent each of the 4 watershed groups shown in the map here in the region. Our role is completely non-regulatory, so we facilitate collaborative decision-making in support of salmon restoration and sustainability. Habitat protection and restoration is a key strategy in our regional salmon plan, and climate change influences how we approach this strategy. Specifically, climate change will cause future habitat degradation, whereas our current restoration projects are really focused on repairing habitat from past activities. If we consider the future degradation of habitat, should we be doing anything different? That was the question that we started with and the question that we set out to address. The climate adaptation framework was developed in response to this need, and it was informed by a combination of best available science as well as local knowledge. It's fair to say that climate vulnerabilities of salmon are generally well understood. Certainly in our region, there are several published climate vulnerability analyses of salmon. What is less developed are the local strategies and actions to mitigate or adapt to those changes. Climate change is like this big bad cloud that hangs over our salmon community. And many people I work with question whether local actions could be effective at all. Our goal was to give practitioners and planners a forward-looking perspective on how their actions can contribute to future resilience of habitat for salmon, steelhead, trout, and char in the region. The climate adaptation framework focused on 4 major climate stressors: warming stream temperatures in the summer, decreasing summer flows, increasing winter floods, and sea level rise and coastal erosion. And we recognize that there are other climate stressors that affect salmonids, but these are the 4 that we were focused on. Oh, my thingy is not going forward. There we go. The Climate Resilience Index is part of our adaptation framework, and it's the focus of my presentation today. The index describes climate resilience of salmon and their habitats at the watershed level and identifies what actions may improve resilience over time. Okay. We've talked about definitions today, and so our starting definition for climate resilience, it was important to lay that out. Defined as the ability of a species or habitat to recover from disturbance or change without a significant loss of function. For the climate adaptation framework, we needed to translate this into salmon habitat or salmonid habitat. And our working definition is that climate resilient habitat occurs when ecological processes to support the salmonid life cycle remain intact when exposed to climate impacts. With this working definition, we set out to quantify or describe climate resilience of salmonid habitat by looking at the components of resilience as described in the literature and as shown here on this slide. Specifically, we described 3 components of climate resilience: climate exposure, ecological sensitivity, and social adaptability. So climate exposure is the physical, chemical, and biological changes occurring due to broader shifts in climate. So changes in stream temperatures, changes in stream flow. Ecological sensitivity is the watershed characteristics that influence the extent that climate impacts are felt in an area. And social adaptability is the capacity of human systems to respond to changing environmental conditions. Well, sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble with the forward and back here. To develop a spatially explicit index, we quantified these components at the scale of subwatersheds or HUC-12s in the region. And so for reference, each HUC-12 watershed is approximately 40 square miles or 104 square kilometers. This scale is useful because it aligns with the watershed scale restoration planning that is currently occurring in this region. And so what we were doing could be transferred into the on-the-ground work. To develop the index, we needed to think about what we were aiming to be resilient towards. And this is where the 4 climate stressors came back into picture. Again, they have summer stream temperature, summer low flow, winter peak flows, and sea level rise and coastal erosion. Each climate stressor is then associated with specific metrics relating to the 3 components of resilience. I apologize, I can't seem to get the forward thing to work. So each stressor is then associated with these specific metrics of climate resilience, climate exposure, ecological sensitivity, and social adaptability.
Oh, I think you can ask our tech team to advance the slides and just forget the clicker function if you'd like.
That would be
just
fantastic.
To make things move more smoothly. Yeah.
Okay. Next slide. Oh, we're good right there. So the metrics come together in a mathematical equation into a single calculation of climate resilience for each subwatershed in the region. Next. This slide shows the list of metrics used for calculation. The metrics were selected because they were biologically meaningful, but also because there was available spatial data. So each HUC-12 watershed had a single value for each metric, and that was used to calculate an overall resilience score for that watershed. So for example, if we look at winter peak flows, there were 2 measures of climate exposure: bankful flow, or that 1.5-year interval, and peak flow, a 25-year frequency interval. Ecological sensitivity to those peak flows would be affected by forest cover, valley constraint, road density, and landslide risk. And social adaptability would be affected by the effectiveness of existing regulations and receptivity to voluntary action. So while most of these metrics were calculated from existing spatial data sets, the social adaptability metrics were not available in that format. And you may be wondering about this. So in order to incorporate this really important component of resilience, we needed to develop our own metric. Next slide. The social adaptability was quantified using the knowledge of professionals who work on regulatory and restoration programs throughout the region. And so this was a participatory work group process. Participants helped us to organize parcels by land type, which was by use and ownership. You can see the pie chart on the right. The majority of the land types in this region are some kind of managed forestry. Participants then identified the regulatory and voluntary programs that were applicable to each land type and discussed these programs. And finally, they scored each land type 1 poor to 5 best based on effectiveness of existing regulations and receptivity to voluntary actions. Those scores were then weighted across the watershed to come up with a metric value for that watershed. Next. Because we are describing climate resilience at the sub-watershed level, I wanted to show you an example of how spatial patterns differ among metrics. For example, next, winter floods are a metric of climate exposure. Increases in the magnitude of peak floods will scour salmon redds and cause increased sedimentation. Each watershed in this map is a different color based on the projected changes in winter floods by end of century. Dark green is a value that contributes to high resilience, so kind of little change, and dark orange contributes to lower resilience. And those colors will carry throughout a few maps in this presentation. Dark green contributing to higher resilience, and dark orange contributing to lower resilience. Next. In the context of winter floods, valley bottom road densities are a metric of ecological sensitivity. Low road densities will help to buffer these increases in sedimentation caused by exposure to winter floods. The spatial pattern for road densities is different, and you can see that here, than the pattern for winter floods. In some areas of high exposure, sensitivity is low, and in other areas of high exposure, sensitivity is high. Next. Lastly, the spatial pattern for voluntary action is also different. In some areas of high exposure, social adaptability is high, and in other areas of high exposure, social adaptability is low. So when we're looking at these metrics, all of this is collectively contributing to resilience, but you have to look at everything together to identify what the resilience of that particular watershed may be to the projected changes in climatic conditions. Next. From this information, we put together an overall climate resilience index for each sub-watershed in the region. This combined 22 metrics of exposure, sensitivity, and social adaptability. Next, the index describes spatial patterns in salmon habitat resilience. Next, considers existing ecological or incorporates existing ecological and social conditions, and identifies which actions are needed and where to improve resilience. So a first look at the resulting map here gives an important spatial perspective to climate resilience in the region. In general, watersheds in the north have higher resilience, they're green, and those in the south have lower resilience, they're orange. But there's some interspersed variability within those areas. And for those of us who work in the region, this result makes sense in that the southern watersheds lack a glacial influence, and they have substantially more development and land clearing than the northern watersheds. But the results also beg the question, what now? How can we improve resilience? Where do we protect? And what do we restore? Next. Which brings me to its application. Next. The information that is generated by the Climate Resilience Index is housed in an online interactive tool, and users are able to view the regional map, engage in scenario planning, and explore additional information. The online tool also provides a user guide with a sort of under the hood documentation of the index. And importantly, it provides access to watershed report cards, one report card for each of the 179 subwatersheds in the region. In the next few slides, I will go into an example watershed report card to explain how they may be used by practitioners and by planners. Next. Watershed report cards are an in-depth look at the factors that influence resilience in each watershed. So each report card is 5 pages long. Next, the first page provides an overall climate resilience score and those scores broken down by climate stressors. Next, the second and third pages provide information on which factors have the most influence on resilience. Next, the fourth page provides the value of each metric used to calculate the resilience scores. And the last page describes the land types that are present in the watershed. Next. I'm going to give a brief example of a watershed report card from one watershed, the Lower Clearwater River, shown in a white outline on the map on the right-hand side. Next. This is a figure from the first page of the report card that breaks down the climate resilience score across the 4 stressors: summer stream temperature, summer low flow, winter peak flow, and sea level rise. The blue diamond represents the resilience score for this watershed, the Lower Clearwater River. The gray bar represents the range of scores for the entire region. And the blue bar is the range of scores for the area that is covered by the habitat strategy of that local watershed group. There are 4 watershed groups on the Washington coast, so that gives a little bit more of a local perspective. In the Lower Clearwater River, resilience scores for summer stream temperature, summer low flow, and winter peak flows are intermediate to the rest of the region. Next. Resilience to each of these stressors can be improved, but there's more room for improvement in resilience to the 2 summer stressors, temperature and summer low flow, than to winter peak flows. The sea level rise stressor associated with the Lower Clearwater River also has a fairly good resilience score, but it's important to note that this stressor is actually external. This watershed is not on the coast, so while the coastline, so while the fish from this watershed will be influenced by sea level rise in the nearshore environment, there's nothing to do in this watershed about that particular stressor. Next. This next set of graphs shows 11 metrics that represent ecological sensitivity of the climate resilience index. On the left set of panels, these are the metric values. Each metric is listed on the y-axis, and along the x-axis is a value of 0 from worse to worse or contributes to lower resilience, to 1 better contributes to higher resilience. The blue diamonds then show the metric values between 0 and 1, so they have been scaled. On the right, the panels show the metric influence on the climate resilience score. Metric influence is the change in the climate resilience score if that metric increased by 25% or decreased by 25%. So a metric with larger bars on the right-hand side will have a larger influence on resilience than a metric with shorter bars. And the dashed vertical line on the right is for your reference. That is the existing resilience score calculated for the Lower Clearwater River under existing conditions. So the top set of figures show the 4 landscape metrics. Next. In the Clearwater River, you can see that the base flow index has a moderate value on the left, but a high influence on resilience. And so while the value of base flow index is limited by the natural potential of the landscape, the influence of this metric on resilience is notable. Resilience can be improved, therefore, by protecting or restoring ecological functions that sustain base flows in this subwatershed. The bottom set of figures shows 7 landscape metrics, condition metrics. In the Lower Clearwater River, higher values of landscape condition occur for wetland intactness, riparian intactness, and forest cover. Next. You can see there. But in the of those three, riparian intactness and forest cover have a larger influence on climate resilience, meaning that actions to maintain riparian intactness and encourage forest maturation will be especially important to climate resilience. Lower values of landscape condition include invasive plants, water use, and valley bottom road density. Next. And of these, valley bottom road density had a larger influence on climate resilience, meaning that actions taken to remove or move roads out of the valley bottom where possible will be especially important to climate resilience. So from this type of information, we start to see the factors with the most potential to protect or improve resilience of salmonid habitat in this watershed. Next. The next graph of the report card shows the metrics that represent social adaptability of the index. Next. In the lower Clearwater River, all of these metrics are of moderate value, shown by the graph on the left-hand side. And the regulatory effectiveness and voluntary receptivity on the right-hand side have a large influence on climate resilience. This means that education and outreach with local landowners will be really important aspect of improving climate resiliency in this watershed. And just as a side note here, in the Clearwater River, the predominant land use falls into one of three land types: conservation forests, state upland forests, and private forest land. And so the willingness to engage in actions needed to improve resiliency is likely going to differ amongst those forestry land types. Conservation forests typically managed for late successional characteristics, whereas private and state upland forests are managed for timber production. So collaboration will be essential, and nuanced approaches to those collaborations should be part of that strategy for improving resilience over time. Next. So based on this information, we provide a list of priority actions specifically targeting climate resiliency in this watershed. First, maintain riparian intactness and promote riparian forests. Maintain the metric value and improve the quality not captured by the metric. Second, maintain intactness of the upland forest where practical. Maintain the current value. Third, decrease value bottom road density where practical. Improve the metric value. And fourth, and very important, is increasing collaboration with forest managers is what is needed to advance the priorities of 1, 2, 3. Next slide. So where do we go from here? As I mentioned, our work in climate resilience was developed to guide habitat protection and restoration on the Washington coast. On the ground work for habitat protection and restoration is done by tribes, by agencies, and by nonprofit organizations. So as a regional salmon recovery organization, we're uniquely positioned to influence and guide the strategies and actions that are taken by these groups. Next. In talking about next steps, I first want to address some of the technical uncertainties with this tool. Importantly, the tool is designed to be refined as new data becomes available. And so next, through the process of developing this index, we've also developed several important realization of several important gaps in the data that are being used for the index. And these include an understanding of the biological consequences of sea level rise, inaccuracies in wetland data that are likely underrepresenting wetlands, particularly forested wetlands, and then continual updates to climate projections and the need to update the tool in response to that work at the international level. Next. There are also climate impacts that we were not able to incorporate because there simply weren't spatial data sets available. And so that included wildfire risk, ocean conditions such as ocean acidification and harmful algal blooms, and invasive species interactions, and particularly for us would be green crab and smallmouth bass. Next. In my opinion, one of the most significant outcomes of this work is that a climate resilience lens causes us to think and talk about restoration actions and land use together. Resilience depends on addressing these climate stressors such as stream flows and temperatures, And this is going to require a consideration of land condition as much as it does site-specific restoration projects. The tools that I shared today could be used in a number of different ways. Next. Project sponsors can use spatially explicit climate resilience information as an important context when developing habitat projects. What are the stressors that that particular reach of river, that particular watershed will experience over the next 50 to 60 years as predicted by this index tool? Next. Organizations that specialize in outreach can target areas of highest need. So where the receptivity to voluntary actions or effectiveness of regulations are to have high influence on our ability to improve resilience, those are areas that might be specifically targeted for outreach. Next. Watershed planning groups can examine different scenarios and refine existing watershed scale restoration strategies to include climate resilience. And I've had the opportunity to participate in some of these discussions, and it really has broadened the conversation. The tool can also be used next to identify species-specific vulnerabilities. And that's not something I've specifically talked about this afternoon, but this is an option and may be particularly useful where we have species of concern or species listed under the Endangered Species Act. Next. I'll leave you with this picture of participants in one of our 3 workshops. Local knowledge of these individuals was an essential part of developing the index. Ultimately, these are the people that will use the information to make the difference on the ground. And so thanks, and I will take any questions if I still have a little time left.
Thank you so much, Mara. That was a really interesting talk. And as you say, this is a very impressive approach to making the linkage between restoration actions and land use together, bringing those two together in such a visually effective way. And a powerful tool. Thank you. We've got lots of action on the Slido poll, and I'm going to get right into it so that we can get to as many questions as we can. The top one, you mentioned in your talk that the pattern of seeing northern watersheds being generally more resilient than southern watersheds, and you attributed that to the glacial influence. How do you anticipate that changing over time, considering reduced glacial melt and the reduction of glaciers overall?
Yeah, so there's 2 pieces that will affect the Olympic mountains, which is really the source of cold water in the northern watersheds. One of the glaciers, and the other is the snow elevation. And so glacial melt is anticipated to decrease. And also of great importance, the snow elevation is anticipated to increase. And so what that means is we get more water in the winter and less water in the summer. And that's part of the reason that the exposure to summer low flow is so dramatic, has so much dramatic change predicted for the Olympic mountain area. So if we just looked at what the exposure will be to climate impacts, actually the worst exposure is in the most pristine areas, which is inside the national park on the Olympic mountains, for that reason.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, really interesting. A question from Sam James, I think, is a nice tie to this conversation, and asking about just how static these report cards are and how often they might need to be updated. So Sam says these report cards are amazing and could really be a valuable management tool. But given rapid environmental change, would the scores differ a lot a few years from now, especially say if any kind of significant events were to happen in the basin? How long would they stay relevant?
So you saw sort of the list of metrics there. They are each able to be updated. Some of the climate projections are the most dynamic right now in terms of the need to update. And so certainly we set this up in a way that the calculations could be updated, and therefore the report cards could be updated as well. So from what I have, of the metrics that we are using. It's the climate projections that probably need the closest attention to how those change as the science becomes available.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Could you briefly describe the financial and time investment to build this powerful tool? That might be challenging to do briefly, but yeah, if you could take a stab at that.
So Laura, your question faded out just for a moment there for me. The question was, what was the time investment in creating this tool?
Yeah, a time and financial investment, I think. Yeah, is what the.
So this was actually a pretty low budget project. I was fortunate to have a fellow from Washington Sea Grant join us for a year and a half, and this was her focus for that time, which was fantastic. And she did an amazing job. That was my co-author on the talk. And then pieces of my time as well. We did tap into many of the partners that regulatory partners that we work with in the region, and I can't really put a amount or time on their involvement, but we had work groups that met 3 or 4 times. We had a core team that met monthly and sort of donated their time to the project. And then we had a facilitator that helped us to facilitate workshops. So, but really, like monetarily, we're not talking about more than $100,000 to do this work.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, that's really helpful and impressive body of work in a relatively short amount of time. Has there been any look at how this climate resilience index might vary among species of salmon?
Yeah, so one of the pieces I didn't go into, simply trying to think about what to present or not, is how we incorporated species into the development of the index, because different species, a chum salmon, will be influenced differently by the combination of summer and winter climate impacts than a steelhead trout, simply because by the longevity of how long they exist in freshwater, and as well as where they exist in freshwater. And so those part of the coefficients that were developed to weight the different climate impacts incorporated each species incorporated there was a species specific coefficient, and then we included those species in a watershed that were known to be present in that watershed for the calculation. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but the point is that the effects on summer temperature, summer low flows, winter flows, and estuary and nearshore impacts of sea level rise are going to be very different across the different species. And so needing to sort of think about that and think about which species are being influenced in a given watershed.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We'll pull a question from Rachel Benbrook off the Slido list. Were the results by subbasin quite variable, or did certain factors rise to the top, being more sort of generalized across a larger areas or more subbasins?
Yeah, so they varied. It was very interesting to kind of crank out and look at the different results for the different subbasins, and they definitely varied among subbasins. The influence of the social adaptability was across the board important in all of the areas. In some subwatersheds, more so than others, simply depending on what land types were present.
Okay, we've got a number of questions that we're going to hold on to and save for panel, and when we bring you back in just a short time, but I'm going to pass the mic over to Jason and sort of keeping to our schedule here for him to introduce our next speaker.